We use the term domination way too much in sports and in college football, but Washington dominated, dominated with an exclamation mark, underlined, capitalized Stanford 44-6 on Friday night in the first of three matchups between top 10 teams this weekend. Hopefully, the other two matchups, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Clemson, Louisville, will be closer and more entertaining because the Huskies were all over the Cardinal. Stanford came in as a 3.5-point underdog despite being the team in the North Division. The game was in Seattle. Stanford had some key injuries to deal with, in particular, both cornerbacks. Starters Quentin Meeks, who came into the game with 4 career interceptions, and Elijah Holder, certainly a player that we've been familiar with in recent years, with 16 games played and 5 passes defensed this season. Stanford also missing wide receiver Francis Owusu and also fullback Daniel Marks. Their contribution statistically not much this season, but Marks, we know as a fullback how integral he is to the Stanford offense, and Owusu had 2 receptions coming into the game. The cornerback play was an issue for Stanford as Dante Pettis and John Ross were dynamic in this game and abused the 2 cornerbacks backing up both Meeks and Holder for Stanford. It started with the opening drive. Washington sacked Ryan Burns twice. He had 6 sacks in the first half. Washington had 8 sacks in this game, and consider that the Cardinal had not given up 5 sacks in a game going back to 2008. So in the last 8 seasons, no team had sacked Stanford quarterbacks more than 5 times. 8 sacks in this game, 6 in the first half, setting the tone at 23-0 at the break. Washington wins 44-6. Stanford hasn't lost a game this decisively since back in 2007, 41-3 to Arizona State, and that was just at the cusp of Jim Harbaugh building this program into what it is today. Washington dominated both lines of scrimmage. Jake Browning had all day to throw. He had a comfortable pocket, and one of the nation's most proficient passers and efficient passers coming into this game continued that trend. And we saw a first breakout game this season from Myles Gaskin, who as a freshman totaled over 1,300 yards for the Huskies and had been used in limited, sparingly early in the season for Washington as they blew out their first 3 opponents. And what really proved to be a difference in this game, in addition to the wide receiver versus cornerback matchup when Washington had the football, was also defensively for Washington. They've got the great talent. There are 7 high draft pick potential selections here for the NFL draft for Washington. There were over 20 NFL scouts in this game, mostly scouting that Washington defense. Guys like Sam Wuching, who had 3 sacks and a forced fumble. Vita Vea, who had a big 6'5", 332-pound defensive tackle, was causing havoc, constantly pushing the pocket, pushing the running lanes, and pushing offensive linemen back into the backfield and disrupting Christian McCaffrey in particular, who only had 34 yards rushing. Elijah Qualls, who's a junior defensive lineman, senior outside linebacker Joe Mathis. We saw him splitting gaps, getting into the backfield. He had a big 3rd down sack when the game was still competitive. He also shot gaps to disrupt a 4th down conversion attempt by Stanford. And of course, that Husky backfield wasn't really challenged in this game, the defensive backfield by the Stanford wide receivers, but Budda Baker, Sidney Jones, and Kevin King, NFL prospects in the early rounds as well. This is Washington's biggest victory by score against the top 10 opponent since way back in 1990 when they whitewashed USC 31-0. Washington, a dominant football team in this one. Christian McCaffrey came into the game certainly as a Heisman Trophy candidate. He should have won the award last year, and it's a shame because he has virtually no chance of winning it this year. He's statistically not off to a great start, and in this game bottled up for just 49 rushing yards, 34 in the first half, when it was still a competitive game to a certain extent, although in watching this, it was never competitive from the opening drive. Washington moves on as the North Division power but now they must clear the Oregon hurdle. They've gotten by Stanford. Now Washington, in the catbird seat, as it were, in the North Division in the Pac-12, takes on an Oregon team on the road next week that has defeated the Huskies 12 consecutive years. For Stanford, they try to get off the deck in hosting Washington State. Let's talk up some Pac-12 football right here on Mark Rogers TV.